Jane's husband is an art gallery owner, and he represents several Latin American artists. So we have these images that we'll scroll through at various points, and they actually match really well with some of the poems. So with the images and the poems, we're basically going to deliver liberation theology and the music which we're singing. The genius of this piece, I think, is that MacMillan enacts liberation theology by using the texts of the poems, the liturgical Latin, and his music. Whereas the poems themselves, I wouldn't necessarily say that they embody liberation theology, but the music, the way that MacMillan does it is pretty brilliant. So I want to give you some background on a couple elements. What is liberation theology? Thank God for Wikipedia. It's sort of complicated, so I'm just going to read a couple little quotes here. It is a synthesis of Christian theology and Marxist socioeconomic analysis that emphasizes social concern for the poor and the political liberation for oppressed peoples. So this started in the church, in Latin America, by the clergy. When they saw the oppressed people around them, the poor people, a lot of poor people were coming to church. I think it got the gears working, and they looked at the text that they were teaching, the biblical text, and they started to sort of switch around the way that they would interpret the text and deliver them to the people who were their congregants. So on practice, Wikipedia says that liberation theology strove to be a bottom-up movement in practice with biblical interpretation and liturgical practice designed by lay practitioners rather than by the Orthodox Church hierarchy. In this context, sacred text interpretation is understood as praxis or practice. Liberation theology seeks to interpret the actions of the Catholic Church and the teachings of Jesus Christ from the perspective of the poor and the disadvantaged and the oppressed. In Latin America, liberation theologians specifically target the severe disparities between rich and poor in the existing social and economic orders within the nation's political and corporate structures. And then when the clergy started to see the political oppression, I think that's when liberation theology really became a political movement. And at that point, the Vatican got a little nervous because it was sort of this rogue movement in Latin America where lay people were actually interpreting the text on their own. There's one more section. The social and political impact of liberation theology can be viewed in terms of initial consciousness raising of congregants, the motivation for political involvement, the sense of community they develop, the experience of grassroots democracy, the direct actions they engage in, and finally, direct political action. So I think that's sort of the key there, is you can actually use your interpretation of the liturgical text to protest, to fight against the government, to resist, to speak your mind about what's happening. Ariel Dorfman is Chilean. He was born in Argentina. I think he moved to the United States for a bit, but ultimately ended up in Chile when he was about 10, so he identifies as Chilean. He's taught in a lot of places. When the Pinochet regime took over, put down Allende, who was the democratically elected socialist leader of Chile, Dorfman had to leave Chile. A lot of his colleagues and friends did not, and many of them were disappeared. And we hear this term a lot in liberation theology. And during the Pinochet regime, people were disappeared. What does that mean? It means they disappeared, they were murdered. In some cases, you don't know what happened to them. Some of the images that Jane brought depict disappearances or mothers mourning people who have been disappeared. So in some of these images, the mother is holding up a picture or staring down at a picture longingly. Jane, can you scroll through some of those? So that's just a little background. There's a lot. When you start to dip your foot in the pool here, there's a lot of information. Just a quote from Dorfman. He says, "I'm constantly trying to figure out how you can be true to an experience, which in fact very few people in the world would understand, such as having most of your friends disappear or be tortured, and at the same time finding a way of telling that story so other people in other places can read their own lives into that." And you see how his poems are fairly clear, right? He's not operating on a really deep level of symbolism. There's nothing really hidden in these poems. When you have such vicious material to work with. Sadly, it's very violent and unfortunate, but you don't really have to be an intricate craftsman. You just sort of work with this raw material. He's a good poet. He delivers this material, I find it incredibly poignant, and he gets to the point. He's very concise, like in Sunstone. That's a, 12-line poem, but he really delivers a powerful message. So, apropos of that, let's go to the first poem. And I thought we would deliver these poems in a different way so you can hear them without the music. But actually, I would consider this a choral reading because there's more than one voice.
What did you say? They found another one.
I can't hear you.
This morning, another one floating in the river.
Talk louder.
So you didn't even dare.
No one can identify him?
He said not even his mother, not even the mother who bore him, not even she could.
They said that?
The other women already tried.
I can't understand what you're saying.
They turned him over and looked at his face, his hands. They looked at, right? They're all waiting together, silent in mourning on the riverbank. They took him out of the water. He's naked as the day he was born.
There's a police captain, and they won't leave until I get there.
He doesn't belong to anybody. You say he doesn't belong to anybody?
Tell him I'm getting dressed. I'm leaving now. If the captain's the same one as last time, he knows what will happen. That body will have my name.
My son's, my husband's, my father's name. I'll sign the papers. Tell them I'm on my way.
Wait for me, and don't let that captain touch him. Don't let that captain take one step closer to him.
Tell them not to worry. I can bury my own dead.
So what did you guys notice about that reading? Hurried, confused, secretive. My reading of this poem is that these are people in this town or in this city who have learned something. They're trying to convey the information to each other behind the backs of perhaps secret police, perhaps their own fellow neighbors, who they don't know if they're an informer or not, because when the Pinochet regime came into power, there was the secret police. You didn't know who was going to tell, who was going to report you, and then you ended up disappeared or dead. So it's a very rushed poem. There's a lot of mixed up communication. Why do you say that? I can't hear you, I can't hear you. Until the end, towards the end, it starts to accrue moral power, and then I hear a singular voice, or I had Brenda and Jane read sections, but you start to hear a resoluteness, like at least the speaker can retain his or her dignity, and at the end, I think that is the moral high ground to say, tell them not to worry, I can bury my own dead. So there's dignity amidst the horror of what's happening in this culture at the time. So it's tentative, it's hushed, a lot of whispering in small groups. Now look at the Latin. What is that telling us, and how is that playing against the poem itself? Deliver the souls of all the faithful, departed from the pains of hell and from the depths of the pit. Deliver them from the lion's mouth, that hell devour them not, that they fall not into darkness. So the people who have disappeared are being likened to sufferers in the Bible, right? So here is an example of MacMillan coupling together liturgical text with the poem to enact liberation theology. If people can see themselves as characters from the biblical text, it might empower them. It might make them feel even more exalted or morally outraged to do something. Remember the quotes I read about liberation theology, the idea was to have the biblical texts mean something to people beyond myths or something that's just on paper. It was something that would actually make you do something to resist. I think that's important. So that's what I wanted to say about that poem. You guys want to do the Virgin?
Bring the virgins up.
Yeah, there are a lot of amazing images here of the Virgin. So I'll just say quickly about the Virgin of Guadalupe. That is the Virgin Mary. The myth for Latin America is that this was in the 16th century. There was a citizen named Juan Diego who apparently came upon the Virgin Mary 3 times. And the first 2 times he couldn't believe what he was seeing because it was an apparition. And finally, the last time, she emblazoned the image of herself on his jacket. So he took that jacket and he brought it to the bishop and he said, "Here, look at this happened." And then the bishop believed, oh my God, he saw the Virgin Mary, and I think at that point they built a church. And so that's the myth, but This is like the patron saint of Latin America if you're Christian or Catholic, the Virgin Mary of Guadalupe. So these ladies are going to do this reading.
Sweet Virgin of Guadalupe, O Virgin of the gentle eyes, dark-eyed Virgin, good lady, my love, painted by God's own hand on the cloak of the Indian Juan Diego.
Sweet Virgin, my love, who commanded the bishop to build you a shrine, where my brothers, the Indians, lived in Tepeyatepec in Mexico, outside the city. Flogged and burned were these poor little ones, despised, deceived, and mocked. My brothers, the Indians, 1,000 times mistreated, 1,000 killed.
What did you say to the bishop? You will build me a house outside the city where I will wait, where I can hear the cries, the pleas of my Indian children? Sweet Virgin of Guadalupe, O Virgin of the gentle eyes, dark-eyed Virgin, my girl, my love, I want to ask you this question, dear mother.
Why is it that in Spain, on the far side of our hills and valleys across the sea, why is there another Virgin of Guadalupe, patron saint of the conquerors, men with great beards, men on horses, men with swords and fire who crush and burn our homes and the Indians, your children, still inside?
Why is it, sweet Virgin, sweet mother, why is there another Virgin of Guadalupe, patroness of the conquerors?
Great. So obviously this poem is about massacre, right? Pretty horrific massacre when Latin America was being colonized by the Spanish. But it's also about the love, the incredible, intense love for the Virgin. So the citizens' love of the Virgin, their belief in their religion. Look at the repetition. There are two sections at the very beginning and that small middle stanza where there's this repeated entreaty to the Virgin. How many times can you address the Virgin in how many different ways? Sweet Virgin of Guadalupe, O Virgin of the gentle eyes, dark-eyed Virgin, good lady, my love, painted by God's own hand on the cloak of the Indian Juan Diego. It's a very elaborate address, and to me that says that there's such reverence and love, and so there are many ways to approach the thing that you love, right? And then later, again, this address. So the way that this poem unfolds is there's the address, there's context, you, Virgin, who commanded the bishop to build you a shrine. This is an iteration of the myth, where my brothers, the Indians, lived. And then a reference to the historical horrors that occurred in the colonization. The Indians were flogged and burned. They were killed in vast numbers. And then an iteration of the myth again, with the Virgin asking the bishop to build me a house, which was a church, of course, for the natives, the native peoples. And then the address again. So still we haven't gotten to the crux of the poem. Finally, after all this poem is a question, right? It's a question. Why is it that in Spain, the land of our conquerors, there is another Virgin of Guadalupe, just like you, who is their patron saint, not ours? So there's a split here. How can that be, right? If you're the one thing that we love, and you love us, how can you be over there doing something completely different and killing our people? And then there's reference, a historical reference to the conquerors. You know, the conquistadors had beards. They were known to be rapacious. They were there to find wealth. That's all they really cared about. They came on horses. Nobody had seen horses in Latin America, so that was terrifying in itself. It looked like a monster with a man on top. So this was absolutely terrifying for local people. And then they were killed in vast numbers. So that's the question, right? Why? How could that be? Why is there this schism? And then the final entreaty. Again, why is it sweet Virgin, sweet Mother? Why is there another Virgin of Guadalupe, patroness of the conquerors? So that's a pretty powerful poem. Now, what does MacMillan do with it? He pairs it with this very short Latin text, which we repeat over and over, which I feel is a bed in that piece. It's so calm and ethereal and timeless. Hail Mother, Portal